Hello and welcome to this week. We'll be discussing race, ethnicity, and culture, and we'll also be discussing white racial identity. So, there's a lot to cover this week. Let's get started. So, if you haven't read it yet, there's a case study example at the beginning of chapter 11. And I think it's a really good example. So, the person's name is Jenny. And so she talks a little bit about being born and raised in Arizona. She didn't have any Asian friends. She's a Japanese American woman. And she talks about how she had seen these Japanese images that were portrayed very negatively. So she talks about how Japanese women, in her opinion, were very ugly. They had these cucumber legs, so they're like portrayed as being very fat. These yellow faces, small slanty eyes, flat chest, very short and stocky. And so she essentially talks about, kind of all these negatives of Japanese individuals sexually emasculated. And she says, so this is part of a journal for a class. So she talks about she wants to be tall, slender, have large eyes, full lips, elegant looking. She doesn't want to be the typical Oriental. And so then she goes to University of California at Berkeley, and she essentially realizes like, oh, there's all these other Orientals, as she calls them in her journal, on campus, and she starts to realize that she has all of these white prejudices that she didn't realize that she had. And so, it's kind of this huge rude awakening for her as she starts to experience some of this stuff. And, the straw that kind of broke the camel's back for her was she decided to date this Filipino boy. And, even though she has kind of all these derogatory views towards Asians, she doesn't want to be yellow. She has all these negative stereotypes. She, thinks this guy's good looking apparently. And he's different from the other Orientals on campus. So they decide to go out, and I don't know what time frame this was written. It doesn't have a date. I'm guessing it was, probably several years ago. So they go out, and it's in San Francisco, and there's these two white women that, even though they were seated after them, they get their food first. And so, Jenny and this boy are sitting there waiting, and he apparently makes this big fuss that they ordered first, but they haven't received their food yet, even though these two white women have already received their food, even though they were seated after them. And she's kind of watching this and observing this. And then they finally get their food, but it's very mediocre. She says the fish is overcooked. Was it on purpose? It's her journal. And then they get up and leave, and the guy that she was on the date with, like, puts a tip down on the table and then goes back and takes the tip back because he's like so upset by like how poorly they were treated. And for her, she has this mix of emotions of being like both embarrassed but also proud that he's kind of trying to stand up for, against how they were treated. And for her, it's this moment of realizing like, wow, I was raised one way in a very, like, white society, and I tried to convince myself that, that I wanted to fit into that. And then now that she's in a very different environment, at a university, she's realizing like, oh, I have all of these prejudices and beliefs about people who I am also Oriental. And so it's kind of this, she goes through this process of kind of realizing that maybe that she has a lot of conflict within herself, in terms of conflict about her beliefs, her attitudes, her emotions, and realizing that there are some things that she needs to resolve in terms of her ethnic heritage versus how she was raised. So, a really great example. I think it's awesome. And we'll talk about her case a little bit later as we talk about the different identity models. But within her case, she experiences a lot of denial as she, was raised in a predominantly white area and then encounters prejudice and discrimination against other people, and has to realize that she's also projecting that onto other people herself, even though she's Asian. And she goes through this internal struggle in terms of identity, and trying to figure out like, who am I and who do I want to be, and is it different from what society has told me that I have to be. And then lastly, in terms of this case, there's the idea of the locus of the problem. So society portrays, REC, so racial, cultural, ethnic characteristics, as inferior, as primitive, as deviant, pathological, and undesirable. But is that really the case? And those negative characteristics or portrayal, a lot of times, especially for little kids, it becomes internalized, and it becomes, it impacts self-esteem, it impacts identity. um, and I think movies and TV shows are trying to maybe kind of correct that, right? So now, if you watch a movie or TV show, like, you have to have the team, right? It's like there's one Asian, one black person, one smart nerdy kid, one, there's kind of like everyone, one LGBTQ, like everyone is represented on the team, and the team comes together to, whatever, fight world destruction or fight against the bad guy or whatever it is. So there are subtle shifts, I think, that are occurring, but it's also important to pay attention to how long has this been going on for, and how many people has it impacted from, being little children to adults now. In terms of, when we talk about some of this stuff, something to pay attention to and think about is cognitive dissonance. And this came up in Jenny's case. So, cognitive dissonance is the state of having inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, or attitudes, especially as relating to behavioral decisions, attitudes towards change, that type of thing. So, going back to Jenny's case, you can see very clearly that she has these attitudes and beliefs, or thoughts, and they're dissonant, or they're in direct controversy to who she is. She is an Asian American woman, but she has these thoughts about Asian American women that are very derogatory and negative. Many minorities may experience cognitive dissonance because they're treated one way or told something, but then their race or that information might be inconsistent with their own internal beliefs or personal experiences. So it's important to be thinking about that and paying attention to it. And I put a picture here on the slide, in terms of how that cognitive dissonance can show up in a lot of different ways, not just within this aspect specifically. So, for example, if someone is a smoker, they might have the thought or the belief like, okay, well, I am a smoker, but then smoking causes cancer, or I want to lose weight, but this cupcake looks really good and I want to eat it, or I really need to go to the gym more and try and be healthy, but I just don't really have time to do it. And so there's this dissonance between, a lot of times, who we want to be and what our behaviors actually reflect, right? So I want to be really healthy, but then I'm not going to the gym or eating healthy. So there's this dissonance, or this conflict between those two, if that makes sense. So I'm gonna add this video link into the description. This is a research. It just briefly covers. It's like 3 to 4 minutes. A research study that was done or conducted like probably years ago, because everyone in the video is, it's like black and white, but it's really fascinating. So essentially, no, I won't spoil it. Watch the video. I think it's really interesting. But it essentially shows how blatant cognitive dissonance can be. So when we talk about, there's several different models, and your textbook covers this, and I'm not going to go over every single one, and I'm definitely not going to go over every single one in depth. You can read about it in the chapter. In terms of different identity models, it helps us understand where someone is in terms of their identity, or what stage they might be in. So it's understanding, again, right, increasing that awareness, understanding ourselves, paying attention to and wanting to be committed towards social action if we're in that stage. So for Jenny, what stage is she in? What identity stage or phase is she in? And she goes through multiple stages as she goes from having like a complete lack of awareness of, the fact that being raised in a white society impacts her at all, or impacts her views at all, to being aware of like, oh, she even says in here, like, oh, I'm different from the Orientals on campus, or this Filipino boy seems different from other Orientals on campus. And then in parentheses, she says, I probably shouldn't use that word, Orientals. And so she starts to have this awareness, as she kind of goes through these different stages. And she starts to accept herself as a total person and as a person with an Asian identity as well, as opposed to being in that, kind of previous denial of like, no, I want to have this certain look or be this certain way. I don't, she even says, I'm not going to be a typical Oriental. And then she starts to kind of realize, what's going on there and start to accept herself as an Asian person. So in terms of models, they each have a ton of different stages, and it can be really easy to confuse them. But when we talk about these, and and by no means like I've never worked with someone from a diverse culture and been like, I think you're in this model or in this stage of this model. So remembering, and yeah, you could do that if that's helpful, but it's more about helping people process through what's going on in them internally, what's going on out in the world that's impacting his or her views, and helping that person make sense of it in a way that works for them. So that's what I want to say here. Let's get into, in a couple slides, we'll actually get into the different models. Oh, nope, just kidding. We'll get into the models now. So the cross model has a couple different assumptions about it, but let's actually discuss the different stages. So pre-encounter stage, and this is for African Americans specifically. African Americans consciously or unconsciously devalue their blackness and concurrently value white values and ways of being or beauty standards or whatever it is, ways of life. There's this strong desire to assimilate and acculturate into white society. And I think I might have shared this example maybe in a previous lecture where I talked about how, one of my cousins is white. We're about the same age. And they were visiting. I think we were like 7 or 8. And, I said to her mom, like, oh, we want to be the same color, right? Because when you're cousins, you want everything to be the same. You want the same dolls and the same hair and the same clothes. And so, I told her mom, like, oh, we're going to try and be the same color. And her mom laughed and was like, well, you would either have to spend no time in the sun or she would have to spend all of the time in the sun to be able to, for her to tan, to be dark enough to get to your color. And at the time I was just like, I didn't realize really what she was saying. I was like, well, I guess she could spend a lot of time in the sun, but that would probably be boring and she probably doesn't want to burn. So yeah, lack of awareness. In the encounter stage, the Black person encounters a profound crisis or event that challenges his or her previous way of thinking and behavior. So some type of experience that shifts their worldview. And going back to Jenny, you saw how she experienced this kind of shift in worldview and maybe it's kind of several or multiple small shifts. And then, there's kind of that one incident that broke the camel's back. So she's going through these small shifts as she moves from Arizona to being on a college campus where there's now suddenly she's surrounded by other Asian individuals, and other different cultural, I'm guessing culturally diverse individuals, being is that it's a college campus. And so she's starting to slowly go through these different experiences. And then there's this one big experience where they're clearly treated very differently. And so there's kind of this slow awakening, or it could be a profound crisis where this person realizes, or this person starts to experience a range of emotions: anger, guilt, according to the textbook, guilt at being brainwashed by white society. So that's the encounter stage. And then you've got the immersion stage, which is the person withdraws from dominant culture and becomes immersed in African American culture. So Black pride begins to develop, but internalization of positive attitudes towards one's own Blackness is still very minimal. But there is that increased sense of pride. So they're starting to identify with, their culture of origin. And then there's internalization. So that person gains inner security, as they resolve kind of the old identity, and the new identity becomes resolved, and there's less of that cognitive dissonance that we just discussed, and they become more flexible, more tolerant, and more multicultural. And then internalization commitment. So this is they become more committed towards social justice, social change, civil rights, that type of thing. In terms of assumptions, there's this assumption, and you'll see this in the next slide, of moving from like psychological dysfunctionality or psychological unhealthiness to psychological healthiness if you go through the stages. And Cross did make some changes in later models. Um, it is important to know that Cross's work influenced other individuals who went on and developed other cultural models of identity. But something to be thinking about in terms of some underlying assumptions that might be occurring either in Cross's model or other models of identity. So, here are a couple discussion questions, just kind of bringing it back to our role as therapists in terms of how do we handle situations, if there's conflict or challenges within the therapy space. How do we handle that? How do we work through that? How do we respond to it? What needs to be done on our end when working with clients? That type of thing. In terms of cultural humility, therapy, there's several different implications in terms of the models that we've talked about. So, what do you think some of those implications are? Well, basically, it all comes down to, you can see the slide here, and some of the things that I think we've talked about at multiple points at this point. Multiple times throughout the semester in terms of being open, being flexible, being respectful to different individuals, different cultures, different backgrounds and history. So it all really comes down to trying to understand who that person is. And sometimes we might fumble through that, which is totally okay because we're not going to know everything, or we're not going to, maybe completely understand what someone else is going through, right? There's all types of experiences that I've never had to go through. I've never, for example, been homeless. And so I can approach that person with empathy, but I myself have never actually been homeless. And so I'm sure that there are all types of things that go with that in terms of how that person might be treated or how others might look at them that I myself have personally never gone through. And so we can do our best to understand that, knowing that, there might be some things that just because of whatever the situation is that we might never fully understand. And also paying attention, I think I've said this multiple times at this point, that we all have our own stuff, right? And so we also have to pay attention to and make sure that our own stuff, our own identity, all of those, our biases, our beliefs, our values, etc., that those aren't negatively impacting the client, or that we're making space for both, in terms of kind of paying attention to, okay, how are my own beliefs, my own assumptions impacting how I view this person that I'm working with, or the assumptions that I might be making about them, and how do I put all of that in check so that I am able to be present and try to understand the person that I'm sitting with, as opposed to just, focusing on me and what I'm going through as a therapist, because that's not probably going to be helpful for my client. And so one of the best ways to go about doing this in terms of trying to understand others is to just ask. Personally, I think it's better to ask than make assumptions, right? Because assumptions aren't usually helpful. Recognizing that, it's important to remember that there's different phases or different models. We just talked about that. But if you just ask in a way that is open, that's honest, that has cultural humility kind of ingrained in it, like, hey, I don't know how to word this correctly, but I'm curious about this. Help me understand that. Or, I don't know what your response will be for this, but help me understand what you're going through. I have a question about XYZ. And when you say it that way, or when you word it that way with that tone, people understand that you're not attacking them, you're not coming after them, you're just trying to understand so that you can help them. And so even if you word it poorly, or even if you word it in a way that there's, we talked about microaggressions recently, even if you word it in a way where there's maybe a microaggression baked in there that you don't have awareness of, because you're coming at it in a way that's like, hey, I want to be, I'm trying to be open about this, I'm trying to understand, help me learn here, people will most of the time treat it as like, okay, let me help you, or let me, because we as therapists don't know everything. There's no way that you're gonna know everything about everybody, about every culture. But if you approach it in that way, people understand that you're trying to be genuine, you're trying to be open, you're being non-judgmental, and so they'll give you some grace or have some patience with you most of the time, and say like, okay, well, this is what this experience was like for me, or this is what growing up was like, or what I had to go through here, and they answer in a way that's, they're not gonna, most of the time, not gonna take offense to whatever your question was. If you guys have not figured this out yet, I really like incorporating YouTube videos into my lectures. And that's because, again, I think it just adds such a wide range of depth and additional information that, like, I could talk about, but at some point you'd probably get really bored. And also, videos make it more interesting. So I found this video and I think it's fascinating because a lot of us, I would guess, have either seen Disney videos, or a lot of you guys were probably raised on Disney movies. And so on the front end, they seem really innocent, right? Like it's cartoons. But this video does a really good job of like peeling back the layers and questioning or pointing out some of the issues and racism within Disney movies. So I'll put the link in the description. What do you guys think about the video? And are there other examples of like racism or stereotypes within Disney movies, or any movies really, that you can come up with? Yeah, great example here. So since we've talked a lot about, I've incorporated media, news, social media, etc. I've talked about it quite a bit, I feel like, over the course of this semester. And if you don't know, I also really like Brene Brown's work. If I haven't mentioned her at this point in the class, she is a social worker, and she does a lot of research into courage and shame and emotions and all kinds of fantastic stuff. And so sometimes I like to just put sometimes it helps for to see things visually. And so you can see here how, there's kind of the outer um like layer of the shame web here is there's like advertising and television and movies and books and marketing and all of that. And then as you kind of, so those are things that, we kind of all touch at some point throughout the day or the week. And then kind of a step in is like individuals that are a little bit closer to us. So say our faith community, our colleagues at work, our teachers, our professors, individuals in the community, say at your local gym or, at your local Y, or whatever places that at the supermarket, places that you might go on a daily or weekly basis. And then a step in is like friends, family, people that a lot of us would view as closer to us. And then there's, kind of us there in the middle in terms of, it's, and I don't know if you can read it, the wording is a little bit small. But in terms of like trapped, powerless, isolated. And then on the sides of the picture, it says, on the right side, it says how you should be. On the bottom, it says who you should be. And then on the left, it says what you should be. And so we get all of this information, all of this communication from magazines, from advertising, from TV. I feel like I've said this multiple times at this point in the class. From family members, from friends, who you should be, how you should be. And some of you guys have talked about that quite a bit, especially in the microaggressions discussion of like, my friends or my family are always asking me, when am I going to settle down and get married and have kids? Or, when am I going to show up to church more? Or when am I going to find a good boy or a good girl? Or, et cetera, et cetera. So we have all of this communication from every level. And, of course, our friends and our family care about us. But there's all of this communication and microaggressions about who we should be, how we should be, we should be doing. And that can create, of course, a lot of emotions in terms of how we view ourselves, maybe feeling frustrated, et cetera, et cetera. We'll talk about this a little bit more in the next slide. So, because, I think this is really interesting stuff. Today, everywhere you click, any website that you're on, we're constantly bombarded with ads telling us to buy this or subscribe to that or to check this out now. So think about your internet usage on a regular basis, on a day-to-day. If you watch Hulu or YouTube, they've got constant commercials and advertisements unless you pay extra, right? So YouTube's got the like whatever the next stage is that you can pay and not have to watch commercials or advertisements. Hulu has the same thing. If you listen to podcasts or music, like Spotify or Pandora, those all have commercials or advertisements. Sometimes it's embedded within the podcast, or sometimes it's the podcaster themselves doing an advertisement like, hey, this is my advertisement for, they don't say it that way, but like, hey, I'd like to thank this sponsor, AG1 Greens, or, whoever, for sponsoring this. You can buy their product here. It's a great product. I've used it. So there's all this advertising that's done. Right. So going back to that shame web, all of this information about you should buy this, you should do this, you should be this way. So today the number is really high in terms of advertising. So on average, how much advertising do you think that you experience in a day? Well, the average person sees around 10,000 ads per day. Although, that could vary. Obviously, if you're maybe on Facebook a little less today, maybe you don't see that many ads. Or, if you just hang out at home and don't really go anywhere, maybe you don't see that many ads in a day. Or if you have the TV turned off, And this is ads that are just online. So this isn't considering ads that are, in the newspaper. Who reads the newspaper anymore? I'm sure someone out there is reading the newspaper. It doesn't include, what else? Advertisements maybe posted at the bus stop if you're standing at the bus stop waiting, like there's advertisements on benches, or it doesn't include billboard signs. So this is just 10,000 ads per day that we see solely through being engaged on the internet in some way, through Google ads, through Facebook ads, etc. Google launched their AdWords in 2000, and in 2007 its revenue from ads was over 16 billion. In 22, its ads the revenue from ads was over 224 billion. That's nearly 13 times more from 2007 to 2022. Billion. In 2022, Facebook's advertising revenue amounted to 113 billion, which shows a decrease. So, and I don't know, you might be able to see it in the picture on the left. So it went down a little bit in 2021, but it still drastically increased from 2020. So 2020, their revenue was 85 billion, and then it went drastically up, and then 2021, and then it came down a little bit 2021, but still, so it went from 113 billion in 2022. In 2021 it was 115 billion, so it went down a little bit. Whatever. They're making billions from advertisements. And this is, as I mentioned, it's only considering online ads. It's not considering billboards or other types of things. And so, what are these advertisements for? It's for skincare. It's for, your face has got to look better, or you have to wear these specific clothes, name brand clothes, or this store to be cool and fit in, or you have to have this luxury car to make a statement. If you don't do these things, social media might shun you, or the news might shun you, or like pick you apart. And you've probably seen that as well, right? All this judgment of, hey, this celebrity, they're letting themselves get fat, or they're letting themselves get old. They didn't put their makeup on before they went out today. They shouldn't look that old. And so it's this shame around, oh, you're not doing what we as society think is important. You're not looking a certain way or doing a certain thing to look that way. I recently noticed this more. I don't spend a ton of time on Facebook, but it seems like recently every other post or picture I see is some type of sponsored ad. And so it's like constant. It's the same for Pinterest. I don't spend a ton on Pinterest either, but more and more I'm noticing like, okay, it's constant. It's not like scroll, oh, there's an ad, scroll. Now it's like scroll, ads, scroll, ads, scroll. It's constant. So what do you think that they're trying to accomplish? Well, YouTube wants as many people watching as possible for as long as possible. Why? Because look at how much money they're making from advertising. And so the more that they can show, hey, we have all these millions of billions of people watching for this long, the more money that they're going to make from advertising. So yeah, anyways, all right, enough of my soapbox, but just wanting to talk about, so bringing it back to how does this impact culture and identity? Well, because we're told subtly, and we don't even think about it or realize it. These advertisements are suggesting that we should be a certain way or look a certain way or accept a certain look, accept a certain beauty standard, that type of thing. And so it impacts, going back to that identity piece, of how we're raised, what we eat, what we choose to buy, and oftentimes how we are told to view other people. And we often don't even realize that it's happening because it's so subtle, or because 10,000 advertisements in a day is an overwhelming amount, to the point where you just kind of tune it out and you don't even realize it, but you're still seeing it, even if your brain is kind of like, it becomes more subconscious, because you're not like, oh, there's advertisement number 1. Oh, there's advertisement number 2. Anyways, okay, enough of my soapbox. I think this stuff is fascinating. So let's move on. So I don't think I've put this into this semester yet, but if you were in my fall class, you probably saw this video. So just since we talked about beauty standards in the last slide, I wanted to incorporate this. This is a little bit of a longer video. I want to say it's in the like 10 to 12 or maybe 15 minute. But it's interesting because it talks about what are beauty standards that are desirable based on different cultures. So in America, we have certain beauty standards, right? You've got to be, tall, thin, have big boobs, big butt, have that kind of like Coke bottle look. If you're male, you've got to have big abs and big muscles and be thin and not have a beer belly. But it's important to also think about or consider what are other cultural standards of beauty because other cultures have very different beauty standards. So it's interesting because some of it is stuff that I never thought about until I watched the video. So we're going to switch gears a little bit and move into chapter 12. So, what is privilege? Privilege is a special right, an advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group. And your textbook uses this interesting example of privilege being like oxygen. So we all breathe it in, and sometimes, we take it for granted. I don't think about I'm breathing oxygen right now. I just go through my day breathing oxygen because it's so plentiful, it's available. But it's only then when we're maybe deprived of oxygen where we become frighteningly aware of its presence or lack of presence. For example, if you're drowning in a pool, you're suddenly like, I need oxygen right now. So privilege can also come in many different forms. So for example, I have a doctorate degree. That's a form of privilege and enables me to do a job that I love while making good money and being able to afford bills, pay bills without stressing about money. So that is one form of privilege, but that's different from, like, say, for example, having white privilege. My skin tone is obviously not white, so I don't have that privilege. What is white fragility? So this is discomfort and defensiveness on the part of a white person when confronted by information about racial inequality and injustice. So essentially, like, becoming offended or really uncomfortable when there's like blatant facts of like, hey, this is racism or this is injustice or inequality. And it can become really easy for that person to say like, oh no, that there's this denial aspect. Oh no, that's not actually happening. Racism isn't alive anymore. That kind of thing. All right, so a couple discussion questions, just questions to think about. Privilege. So if we were in class, we would do this exercise. It's a really powerful exercise, and we did it when I was in grad school, and it was really interesting. So you'll see how, everyone lines up and then someone reads different prompts. And from those prompts, you either step forward or you step back. And it can be a really interesting exercise in terms of looking at how, where people are at the end of the exercise. So I won't spoil it anymore for you, but definitely watch this video. It's not very long. It's like maybe 3 or 4 minutes. Definitely worth watching. And again, if we were in class, we would do this exercise. So within, there's also several different white models in terms of, going through the same models that we just saw in chapter 11. Again, I'm not going to go through every single one. I'll just go through one of these and then you can read about the rest of them in your textbook. So Hardman developed the Hardman model, named it after, after himself. So the naivete stage is a lack of social consciousness or awareness. So a white child, for example, might see a black person in a store and loudly comment on, that person's skin because they've never seen anyone with that skin color. That might be harder to believe in today's world, but there are still rural towns or villages that don't have a mix of individuals. Back in the 60s and 70s, my dad was raised on a farm in Wisconsin, and he, I believe, didn't see a black person until he was, I think, a teenager. He told me this story several years ago, and so he didn't know any better. Like, he'd never seen a black person, so he thought like, oh well, maybe that person was rolling him around in the mud or something. And I'm like, what? Like, who just rolls up? Like, but if you've never seen someone or you weren't raised around anyone, how would you know any different? You'd be like, whoa, like, why is their skin color different? Like, oh, mud makes sense to me. So there's just stage 1 or naivete stage. There's this this ignorance or lack of awareness around cultural or diverse factors, racism, etc. In the acceptance stage, there's this belief in democratic ideals that everyone has opportunity, there's equal opportunity to all, that anyone who works hard can succeed, that those who fail because of their own actions, they're just being lazy, they're not working hard enough. And so that's the acceptance stage. There's this, there's this aspect of this stage where again, as you're being raised, white superiority is important. Minorities are inferior, and we talked about inferiority at the beginning of this lecture in terms of some of the negative words or derogatory words that are associated with minority inferiority. There's a lot of victim blaming within this stage, and there's this belief or view that like oppression and discrimination and racism, that's not a thing, it doesn't occur, not in America, that doesn't happen here. And so that is what's happening in the acceptance stage. And then stage 3 is the resistance stage, where the person begins to challenge assumptions of white superiority. So they become aware that they may have racist attitudes, or they may have, mixed emotions in terms of maybe feeling anger or pain or frustration, as they start to realize, like, maybe I'm part of the problem because I'm not doing anything about this issue. The issue being like social injustice or inequality, etc. And then redefinition stage. So this is where the person starts asking questions and confronting their own biases and prejudices and beliefs. And this could take a lot of different forms. It could be going to counseling, it could be making new friends, it could be learning about different cultures. So it could be showing up in a lot of different ways. And then there's the internalization stage. And this is where that person forms a new social and personal identity, as they then make a commitment for social action and say, okay, I'm aware that these things are happening, racism, that type of thing, social injustice, inequality, etc. And I'm going to take steps to make changes in those arenas. So that's the Hardman model or identity model. On page 268 of your textbook, if you've got the older version, it uses the example of a conveyor belt or walkway. And I like this example. If you've been to an airport, a lot of them have the moving walkways. I really like walking on these, actually, to help people get wherever they're trying to get to faster. And you can either walk on it, or you can stand off to the side and, just stand still, and other people will walk by you if they're in a hurry. And so the textbook uses this example of active racist behavior is someone who's walking fast on the conveyor belt. They're actively racist. They're actively trying to, hurt other people or be very negative. And then passive racist behavior is someone who's just standing on the walkway. They're not trying to get anywhere, or they're not trying to be racist per se, but they are still on the walkway. And so basically, by being on the walkway, they're not doing anything to, dissuade racism or take action against racism. And then there's being anti-racist, which is, it's essentially the idea of like a fish swimming upstream. So you're actively walking like the opposite direction of the conveyor belt, like to fight against racism or to be anti-racist. So it's going to take more energy and more effort to fight against, because you're going against the conveyor belt, or you're going upstream, if you will. So yeah, I like this example from your textbook. A couple more discussion questions here to consider, in terms of, have you ever been in any type of situation where you're the only person? I think some of you guys have talked about that in discussion posts. Maybe the one where we talked about microaggressions, where you're maybe not the only person, but definitely in the minority in terms of being like maybe, one of only 4 or 5 kids who were minority individuals at an all-white school, or the flip side of that being maybe the only white person, or a couple white people at an all black or minority school. And so what were those experiences like? Was it uncomfortable? Was it really hard? Were you treated a certain way? Just some questions that we would discuss in class. So this book was really popular a couple years ago when it first came out. And it's, essentially what he's saying here is anti-racist is a verb, it's a behavior, it's taking action consistently, fighting against injustice, racism, etc. And not just being that passive person on the conveyor belt that says like, oh, I see it happening, but I'm not going to do anything about it. And this could show up in a lot of different ways. taking diversity classes, going on field trips, pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone, trying to do things so that you're exposed to diverse cultures, to different populations, so that you get a better understanding. Again, going back to that cultural humility of what does someone else's life look like? What are their experiences like? Basically getting yourself out of your own little bubble. Okay, so I just talked about this in the last slide, but some strategies from the book in terms of, how to be anti-racist. I just talked about, get out of your bubble, be open to different cultures, unassuming, genuine, caring. I kind of said a lot of this during the cultural humility slide. So just some steps that you can take here in terms of anti-racist strategies. A couple more discussion questions. I'll let you guys read over that on your own. And here is your discussion post questions for this week. So this week you do have options. You can pick 1 to 2 questions as opposed to in previous weeks you've had to answer both questions. Here you get a couple options or choices. So I look forward to seeing what you guys write about this week.